This is the first part of a two-part, do we call them series if they're two parts? A two-part series. About how do we talk about difficult issues in the church. And we've titled it The Good Fight, which is kind of a misnomer, but churches do have conflict, and sometimes we handle it well and sometimes we don't. And some of the reasons that we don't handle it well are because we don't know how to talk about things that upset us or make us uncomfortable or make us angry or make us frustrated. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ways that we do that and the ways that we can do that well. A colleague of mine who actually developed this series wrote that life in a community of faith and learning how to talk about it, she said, doing these adult education forums is a sensible move towards strengthening the foundation of our life together, preparing for a viable, lively, healthy future. Every congregation needs to learn and grow together and attend to the well-being of its common life in an ongoing way. There are insights to be gained and skills to be learned or enhanced, attitudes to be cultivated, and connections to be developed. All of which is what we hope will happen as we go through these 2 Sunday mornings and then as we actually gather to have some of these conversations. Now, why are we doing this? Well, you might remember, once again, I will remind you at our annual meeting in January, one of our congregation members suggested that maybe it was time for us to have a serious conversation about mission, how we define it, how we do it, what it means to us, our commitment to it, and how we manage to do mission well and faithfully, given all the other demands on our time and our energy, and especially on our financial resources. So also, I have mentioned, I'm aware of, and maybe you are too, or maybe it's just an urban myth, I don't know, but what does it mean to be a united church? We have been together for 44 years, and we need to remember that there are things that unite us, and we need to honor and appreciate the things in our heritage that are the same instead of always focusing on the things that are different. Is it our theology or our values or our belief? Is it only the way we govern ourselves? Do we really know anything at all about our denominational heritage? Do we care? And are we living in a post-denominational era? What does that say to us? How do we live together and not always make it a point of contention? So this 2 Sunday mornings, this week and next week, and Tom is probably going to take next week, are designed to help us to learn to talk about difficult issues, not to actually talk about them. After we finish these 2 issues, we will set a time for us to come together, probably on a Sunday after church. We'll begin with the conversation around mission because that's the one that somebody asked for. And it may be that in having those conversations, we will discover some additional issues that are festering, that have been there for a long time or have been unattended for a while. And we could decide then whether we want to schedule some time to talk about those. So here's where I can hear all of you saying, well, I don't need to learn how to talk about difficult issues. I know what I believe. I know how to handle these kinds of conversations. I know what we need to do. I'm happy to share that knowledge with everybody else, and so I'm not going to come to these training sessions. I'll just come to the discussions. And that may be true. But let me remind you that the way that churches have traditionally managed conflicts have not always worked. Now, if you are Presbyterian, you are familiar with the way that our church, our denomination, does everything. We laugh and say decently and in order, but it's true. We follow Robert's Rules of Order. And if you go to any large meeting of the denomination, and sometimes meetings here, you will notice that when a difficult issue is on the floor, we have people coming to the microphones, one who wants to speak in favor of the motion, one who wants to speak against the motion, which assumes, of course, that there are only 2 sides to any question. Everybody gets 2 minutes if there's a whole long line of people, and please don't come to the microphone if you don't have anything new to say about the issue, and on and on. And lately we have tried to do it a little bit differently, but we always seem to come back to that way of managing conflict. We allow everybody to say what they want to say, and then everybody just votes the way we all knew they were going to vote in the first place. And usually nothing much new is said after about 30, 40 minutes of this. Now, I don't know how the UCC does things, But I'm guessing it's not much different.
It's not much different. And, Ernie's our parliamentarian, in fact, and a very strict one.
And how?
But I don't think we necessarily say don't repeat anything.
So it just goes on.
It just goes on in a beautiful way. Everybody's voice is valuable.
Yeah. And you know, I think part of the beauty of that is that everybody does get to say what they want to say. The downside of that is that you often hear the same thing, just said in a different way. The thing is, churches don't like conflict. We don't like these kinds of issues. There's part of us that says we shouldn't have those kinds we shouldn't have that kind of conflict. We shouldn't speak to each other that way. We are the church after all. And we can't quite understand how we speak the truth in love and still talk about those things that are hard for us to talk about. So we need to find out how we can speak the truth in love, how we can find a better way of doing things, how we can give people a safe place to express opinions without fear of being ostracized or yelled at or made fun of. So that's where we're going to begin. We're going to talk this week about some of the causes of conflict in the church, and causes of conflict in a lot of places, but specifically in the church, or at least those that we can most easily identify. We're going to talk about how we manage conflict on a personal level. What did we learn growing up about managing conflict? How have we learned to deal with it differently as adults? Does the Bible say anything useful about conflict? And then we're going to talk about what each of us brings to a tense situation. What are our unwritten rules about conflict? And what is our style of dealing with conflict? And what are the unwritten rules in the church that keep us from having that kind of open dialogue? Next week, we're going to talk about learning to speak the truth in love, listening to each other, being able to trust the context. In other words, is this a safe place for me to say what I want to say about mission or the denomination or any other issue that's on the table? How can I find my voice? How can I hear somebody else's voice? And do I respond or do I just react? And that's a big one, because many of us just react. When we hear something that we don't like, we react instead of responding thoughtfully. So then we'll talk about how we address problems restoratively, how can we agree to disagree, and how can we live together in love. So this morning we're going to start with causes of conflict. So this is going around. This is just a little sheet that talks about causes of conflict. What sets us off? And I want to think, when you look at this, under each one, I want you to think about a specific occasion where you either had a part in a conflict when it began, or a disagreement. I don't like the word conflict. We'll use disagreement. And we'll start with that first one, which are listed under data. And amazingly, that's the one that frequently catches the church up. Lack of information, incorrect information, or differing interpretations of information. That can result in everything from just a simple misunderstanding, which can be resolved, to more serious consequences, including the loss of relationship, and can take longer to resolve and may not ever come to a satisfactory community. All of you know, in church communities, we often hear that information was not shared. People will say to the pastors, or they will not say to the pastors, and sometimes they just say it to each other, and sooner or later it comes back to us. They will say, I didn't know that. When did that happen? How come I wasn't told about that? How come I didn't hear that? And sometimes it's because people don't take the time to read the bulletin or the newsletter or check the website or listen to the announcements in church, or you haven't been in church for a while. However it happens, it's a lack of information. That's as simple as it gets, but people can get very upset about not having the same information. We laugh about saying, when people say that to us, we say, well, next time I'll put you at the top of the list of the 400 people I'm going to call this week to share that with you. And you know, I mean, we can laugh about it, but it is true. I mean, people believe that they have a right to information, and you do. I agree with you. But some of it means that you have to take the initiative to get the information that you need. So, I didn't know that. When did that happen? How come I wasn't told that? Also, churches tend to operate in what we sometimes call a silo mentality, and that is that groups or committees tend to think only of what that group or committee is doing. They operate in isolation. They don't think of how decisions they make or things that they decide, anything that they do is going to have some kind of a ripple effect on other committees, other groups, and other people in the congregation. So what we've tried to do this year is put together, this fall, we're starting with common meeting nights for some of our committees, all of our committees in fact. But so that if there's a question about something that's coming up, or you have a decision to make about the way you're spending some of your budget, how will it affect somebody else's committee? And if that committee is meeting on that same night, you can certainly just go ask them. But before you make those decisions, before any of us make those decisions, we need to remember that this is a big church, and that the decisions that are made affect a lot of people, from the very simplest level to the more complex ones. The other thing that can happen is incorrect information is passed along, or people have differing interpretations of it. That's another cause for disagreement. No matter how hard we try to make sure that everybody has the same information, sometimes it falls off the track and something else is reported, something different is reported or passed along, or a decision is made and somebody interprets it differently than it was intended. I always remember that, the game we all played as kids, telephone, where you pass something along through the room, and by the time it gets to the other end, it's entirely different from what you started or what you intended. So we try to be careful to make sure that everybody has the same information, that they hear it the same way, and we're never going to all hear it the same way. But I think it's also our responsibility that if you don't quite get it, or you're interpreting it one way, ask questions. Ask what you need to do. Incorrect information is passed along. The next one has to do with relationships on your sheet, and we're not going to be able to spend time on each one of these probably, but this is the one that I've witnessed in probably all of the churches that I've worked in. People act out, they don't behave, they've never been told that they can't behave a certain way. One of the things that interim pastors sometimes have to do is to just tell people that their behavior will no longer be tolerated. I once served a church where one of the elders resigned from session with some regularity. And that person was always cajoled into coming back. Until the night she walked into my office and put her resignation on my desk, and I accepted it. And we had a later conversation when I told her that I thought it was time that her service to the church was limited to being a congregation member in worship on Sundays. That no longer on session, no longer on a committee, no longer teaching Sunday school. She was a disruptive element, not only to the session, but to the entire congregation. And the way she did it was by storming in, presenting her resignation, and then everybody would circle around. And if you know anything at all about family system theory, you know that if somebody steps out of their regular role, everybody will do everything they can to get that person back. Sometimes that is a difficult thing to do, and it's not something that I particularly like to do, but I could almost hear a sigh of relief go through the session when the next time we met, we voted on to accept her resignation and allowed her to speak to the group and talk about what it was that was bothering her, and thanked her for her service and let her go. What I discovered later was that that was a fairly common behavior throughout that congregation. People had been allowed to behave that way, and so they continued to behave that way to get what they thought they needed or wanted. And it had never been addressed. Nobody had ever said, stop doing that. And it just became a way to get what you wanted in that particular congregation. So, the other thing we want to talk about are structural causes of conflict. That sort of has to do with the fact that resources are limited, including staff, and somebody will feel at some point in time that somebody else has more power than they do, People fight for space, they fight for time in the building, there's no process for sorting it out, and so it all falls to pieces. Or we all believe that it's somebody else's responsibility, or that somebody else is going to do it, and then nobody does it, and then we all get bent out of shape. And finally, values and interests, and there will always be different priorities in a church, and that's really what kind of brought us here in the first place, to say how do you balance those priorities and those important things to people without somebody feeling like their particular project or their particular hope or favorite thing has been dropped to the bottom of the list. And what happens when funding has to be redistributed? All those values and those priorities come into play. So let's talk a little bit about causes of conflict. I want you on the back sheet of that, and we're not going to take time to do this right now, but there is a little, very brief little exercise that you can play around with. When you think about a conflict relatively fresh in your mind, one that you were personally involved with, you do this with your marriage counseling, I know. Remember it as concretely as you can, and then say, what were the causes? What was important to you? Why was it important to others? What happened because of the way it was handled? What were the outcomes, and how did this impact you? How did you feel about the situation? Most of us obviously learned to handle conflict in the family of origin. How was it managed when you were growing up? In some families, it was all on the table, and people, raised their voices and got it all out, and then it was all over and a decision was made. In other families, there was never an opportunity to have that kind of a discussion. Raising your voice was not allowed, and so most of us, unless we learned how to do it differently, go back to the way we learned growing up. And when you think about what your role was in your family of origin, that's probably how you play it out in other situations. And the thing about family systems, as I said earlier, is that when one person or one member of that system steps out and tries to do it differently, the whole system will work to get that person back in that role because they need that person in that particular role. And it's very hard to be the one who steps out of that role and does it differently. And that's probably one of the reasons, how we learn to handle conflict is one of the reasons that most of us are uncomfortable with it. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. And even though disagreement in a family, in a church is normal, perfectly normal, most of us would rather avoid it at all costs. As I said earlier, we might be afraid of our own reaction. We might be afraid that we will end up yelling or walking out or behaving badly in some way. We're afraid that somebody else will verbally attack us, or we will be written off, or we fear that there will be somehow a break in a relationship, or even a split in the church. And certainly that has happened in the wider church, in congregations. Those things do happen. We can't ignore that. So I think we want to figure out how we have learned to deal with it differently as adults. Most of us figure out that temper tantrums don't get you what you want, but some of us haven't. Most of us figure out that stomping off and threatening to leave will sometimes get you what you want, but some of us haven't. Most of us figure out that bullying and threatening behavior can work for a while, but eventually somebody will stand up to your threats and perhaps ask you to leave. Sometimes in a community, the leaders will agree that a person might be happier somewhere else, and I think, as I said earlier, that's one of the most difficult things in the church. We are so afraid that somebody will leave that we find all kinds of ways to compensate for bad behavior. And then if one person is allowed to behave a certain way, then the congregation sees that as a way to get things done, and so that becomes the norm. Sometimes we do have to let people go and wish them well and hope that they find a place where they will be happier. What often happens, however, and we know this too, is that no church is perfect. They're like families. I mean, you can go to different churches. There will probably just be different problems. But I think it's often a time for a person to leave. We have to be able to say, go with God. I want to talk a little bit about unwritten rules in conflict. We all have them in our own families. And think about some that were in your family. We have them in churches. We have them in organizations of all kinds. When I first joined this church 30 years ago and got myself elected to session because I thought that was a good way to start. I look back and think, why didn't I offer to be a deacon? But I can remember my first session meeting, and honestly, Nancy, I think your dad was pastor at that time, and it just evolved into this yelling, screaming match between two members on session. One of the longtime old members of the church, and one of the fairly new members of the church, and it had to do with the budget, as it often does. And it was like, I was just horrified, because we don't talk to each other that way in the church. This is a church. We're not supposed to have those kinds of disagreements and those kinds of conflicts, and we're certainly not supposed to be yelling at each other at a session meeting. And, words were exchanged, and I went home and I thought, I think I've made a terrible mistake saying I wanted to serve on this session. I don't remember how the pastor finally got everybody to settle down, but obviously people did settle down. But that stayed with me a long, long time, because I did come out, I did have that idea that we are the church. We're not to stand up in meetings and yell at each other. And I've since been certainly in Presbyterian meetings where voices have been raised and things have happened, and people have the same reaction. People almost physically step back or sit back when things like that start. And I think we all do that. So some of the unwritten rules that come out of that, and the one that, I think we think, well, if you question a decision, are you automatically branded as the troublemaker? If you disagree with somebody who is older or more experienced, are you considered rude or disrespectful? Does their opinion have more weight than yours just because they've been there longer, or they got it all over you in terms of years that they've been alive? And that was some of what this disagreement was at that session meeting that night. It was somebody my age with somebody who was the age I am now. So, there are things, and sometimes I think what happens is that those unwritten rules just keep things below the surface all the time for years, and they never get put on the table because of those unwritten rules. So I want you to think a little bit, and let's talk about it a little bit. What are some of the unwritten rules in this church? No matter what, think it's their job to speak the truth, irregardless of other people's feelings or how they're going to be perceived, no matter how angry it makes people, no matter the consequences. I was thinking the other day that the church has become, and I'm not sure why, but one of the last places where you can say whatever you want to say, and you will not be excommunicated, as it were. People feel comfortable saying whatever they want to say in the church, and I think we have to not particularly rethink that, but think about how we say those things to each other. And that's what this is all about, is that how we say these things honestly, without just running, roughshod over everybody else's feelings, everybody else's opinions. How do we manage anger and pain when those things are brought to the table? And I think that's really hard to do, because we don't want to hurt each other. We don't want to bring that anger back. So I think this is going to be some of these things are going to be challenging, because I think the first issue that we've identified, that of mission, has also to do with money. And I think that it's kind of, we're still suffering the leftovers and the fallout from that particular conversation, however many years ago it was. So linking us together, or connecting us and helping us find out what's going on in somebody else's life. We probably ought to have that kind of a sharing time around I don't want to say theology, but some of our spirituality and some of our concerns there about where are you there along the way. We often ask our confirmation kids, to think about where was God today? And that's a tough one for them. It's a tough one for all of us. But to, if that countdown at the end of the day, how the good things and the bad things and the things that you could have done better and the things that you did well and where was God? I think that'd be an interesting question to ask the session instead of asking us to share our joys and concerns. We're on the table and say, where was God for you today? And you might, those are things that you can do in small groups, those are things you can do in committees, those are things you can do Bible studies, men's group, those kinds of things. But that's the only way we will get to know each other and get to know where we're coming from, because we do tend to spend so much time doing the business of the church, doing the work of the church. And we are, as you said, we have evolved kind of into that business model. We get the work done, but we kind of leave out once in a while the part that we all bring spiritually and in our heart to this work. So we'll think about those unwritten rules. We'll talk about how do we change them, what it would cost the community if we changed them. Let's think about that. What would it cost this community if we changed some of our unwritten rules, like not talking about money or not putting things on the table that make people uncomfortable. This is a church that has really wrestled with some very difficult issues and have done it well. But I'm guessing that in doing it well, because we're all here and we obviously thought we did it well, there are people who were not of the same mind and didn't think we did it well and who are no longer here. So that's kind of a blind spot too for most of us, because those people either didn't feel like they were heard or they didn't agree with the decision. So what will it cost us if we change some of those unwritten rules? What are the benefits if we change some of those unwritten rules? So I'd encourage you to think about, the unwritten rules here, unwritten rules in other places in your life. What were the unwritten rules in your family? We talked about that. So between now and next week, we do want to think about those things. We will do a little work next week on kind of the things that we bring into a situation that's difficult or disagreeable or with conflict, and we'll talk a little bit about not good responses, bad responses, but what is a reaction and what is a response? What's a helpful response and what's not a helpful reaction to something that's difficult. So you're on. Do you want to say anything more between now and next week?
And to me, I had to go through a process, and this is what's worked for me, is reframing the fact that we're given these difficult issues is a good thing. I've been a member of a dying congregation where all you talk about is, how are we going to pay the rent? How are we going to, keep the doors open? And to have these discussions that are about theology, about mission, and how we program. It's a privilege, and not a chore even, but something that we can do with some sense of joy and creativity.
And the other thing is how do we make this a safe place to express those opinions? And not just safe so that if you say something, we'll all be nice to you, and because we don't want to hurt your feelings, but we still disagree with you. So we're just not going to say anything, and so then that never gets settled. But how do we make it safe for people to say what they need to say what they want to say, and somebody else can disagree and do it in the same way and still feel that they are part of the community, that they haven't been made fun of or told they were wrong or whatever. So, this should be the place where we can have those kinds of discussions.